Oh, hello. Yeah, just the second one tonight in a similar vein. The gorgeous Colin Brazier, who I always think looks like a reject from Anchorman. Anyway, bemoaning the lack of diversity of thought and language in broadcasting. Yeah, it's a Ron Burgundy irony-free zone. Anyway, see what you think about this. As ever, inevitably, he shoehorns quite a lot of 1984 comparisons in. I'm not quite entirely convinced he's read 1984, but hey, prove me wrong on that one.
Now, the comedian Lenny Henry has told Britain's broadcasters not to use that ugly acronym BAME. I think he's spot on. About 1 million years ago, when I started as a cub reporter on a local newspaper, we were told journalists should never deal in generalisations. Where possible, we should be specific. And BAME, black, Asian and minority ethnic, lumps together people whose identities often have very little in common other than they are not white.
Okay, first up, yes, it is important not to lump people together. I'm sure you'll understand my slight cynicism and level of incredulity at a statement coming out from GB News, who regularly will lump an awful lot of different people together. People such as myself, teachers are, lefties are, woke are, trans are, all there together. Anyway, let's carry on, Mr. Journalist, indeed.
I think Sir Lenny is right, but the reaction to his intervention is so wrong. By which I mean what? Well, it's one thing for an esteemed public figure and the lobby group which bears his name to call for changes in the way we talk, the way we describe the world around us. But it's another thing entirely when, en masse and on the instant, every one of Britain's terrestrial broadcasters decide to fall into line with his demand. And that's what happened this week. The BBC, Channel 4, ITV and Channel 5 jointly agreed they would stop using BAME.
Okay, first up, so you agree that they shouldn't use the term BAME, but now you're complaining because they've stopped using the term BAME because they've all done it at the same time. I seem to recall there have definitely been a lot of stuff, for example on GB News, for the last year, complaining bitterly about acronyms such as BAME. I'll post up a link or two to that, obviously.
These organisations all employ journalists who are now effectively being told which words they can use. Just think about that. And as you do...
Right, okay, and yes, so unpack that one. There's actually a journalist Bible which will tell them, most organisations have one, which will tell them which particular phrases are to be used. It's just a way of ensuring editorial quality. However, in this case, it's very, very, very sinister, obviously.
And before we get into why this matters, let me show to you how this isn't some weird Media Land one-off. This week, we learned that the SNP government in Edinburgh is telling Scots which words it approves of and which ones it doesn't. Take a look at this. Out go words like alcoholic, addict and junkie. In come phrases like abstinent person who has stopped using drugs. Why use one word when you can use 7? But if this were just about being verbose, I wouldn't be so worried. For these diktats aren't just the enemy of brevity. There is something else going on here. And when it boils...
Okay, yes, language does change. Again, language does change over time. You may notice that the word alcoholic, addict, junkie have a certain pejorative use attached to them. It's an attempt to get away from that. It's perhaps one of the reasons why we don't describe people with Downs as mongoloid anymore. It's perhaps the reason why we don't describe people with mental health conditions as loonies anymore. I'm sure Colin would probably would wince at the if I use the term cripple about somebody in the wheelchair. It's not sinister on that basis. It's an attempt not to stigmatise the person involved. Still, I sense Orwellianism creeping in.
Down to it, I think it's about control. I'll explain. The SNP leaders who want us to stop using words like addict have presided over a public health catastrophe in Scotland which has by far the worst record for drug deaths in Europe. They will say that by avoiding addict and alcoholic and using bland, euphemistic, meaningless alternatives, they are destigmatising what it is to be a junkie. But as Shakespeare told us, a rose by any other name smells just as sweetly. There are things, expensive, time-consuming things the SNP could do about drug and alcohol addiction, but...
Okay, the SNP does do an awful lot about drug and alcohol addiction. Scotland's drug issues certainly enormously predate the current SNP administration. You only have to think about their large number of HIV deaths during the 1980s. It's a tad disingenuous, that one, but never mind, let's move on.
But it's easier to displace and reframe the debate using language the SNP dictates, literally. It's about control. Control the language, and you begin to control the conversation. And as with the SNP, so with that other acronym, BAME. BAME, it replaced ethnic minorities, which was also deemed problematic. Who found it problematic? A tiny cadre of self-appointed diversity professionals whose livelihoods depend on explaining to us stupid folk how we should speak about the world around us. And they can't explain once because that would leave them out of work. No, this game works by constant reinvention and reiteration. Ethnic minorities yesterday, BAME today.
Yes, and we also don't use certain other words, do we, Colin? And yet nobody's suggesting that HR departments got rid of certain N words or W words in the the English media lexicon because they wanted to keep their jobs. Again, it's a really disingenuous argument. Language changes over time. You will notice, as I say, the basic sense here of an Orwellian creep, and yet. One of the things is that he's actually complaining against Orwellianism. Just to be technical about it, Newspeak in Orwell's time was about dumbing down the language, because that's what fascists do. Right? Fascism instigates dumbing down the language, whereas the language here is not being dumbed down at all. Because by using 5 words as opposed to 1, you aren't dumbing things down in the slightest. That's not the way that it works. Still, let's raise the spectre of 1984.
They, not you, will decide what tomorrow. BAME's fall from grace was so quick that until very recently the BBC's diversity boss was happily using it. Why this constant semantic motion? I repeat, the better to ensure those who control the language control the debate. Not since Britain was ruled by religious authorities has our language been so tightly governed. Then it was regulated by a priesthood. Now we have a secular race relations and diversity industry which is its equal. You might think this doesn't matter, not really. But by setting up a linguistic purity test, those who do so in the expectation that some will fail it. Those who fail it can be replaced by someone more...
Okay, that's a totally spurious argument. It really is a totally spurious argument, in the sense that there are all these people out there just waiting to pounce on you should you fail. What, in HR? I don't think so.
To their tastes. Take one example of many. Last year, the FA boss, a man seemingly without a racist bone in his body, was hounded from office for committing a cardinal sin, for getting the ever-changing jargon wrong, in his case by referring to coloured players. As someone who loves the English language, part of my...
Again, that's slightly disingenuous, and his use of that phrase, which is, let's face it, somehow magically stuck in the 1950s, was only one part of that story. Again, I'll post links.
Objection to what's happening is aesthetic. Look at this. Part of the joint statements put out this week by our broadcasters. This one, it was from ITV's Group Director of Diversity and Inclusion, quote, "We will use the findings to build on our internal race fluency training." Race fluency training. I've got no idea what he's talking about, but that's...
Well, I imagine you do, actually, because I can deconstruct those 3 words very, very... internal means within the organisation. Race, well, that's relating to race. And fluency means ability to. right? Now, I mean, one of the ironies, of course, is people like Colin and the rest of people on GB News will have undergone internal race fluency training. It would have been a mandatory part of their employment package because, hey, that's the way that the equality laws in the UK now work. Now, if he doesn't want to do that, that's fine, but I think he might actually have to resign from his job if he does. Oh, sorry, training as well. I think we know what that means, don't we?
That's exactly how this is meant to be. You're not meant to know what he's talking about. The Soviet communists called these people the nomenklatura, the self-selecting elite who use language to bamboozle and keep in line those outside of the magic circle. By creating...
Okay, and yes, that was a disparaging term, and again, he's not really using that very correctly. But hey, let's raise the spectre of communism, despite the fact that the dumbing down of language is associated with fascism. Never mind that, eh?
This bizarre semantic cartel, Britain's broadcasters have once again shown that for all their talk of diversity, they're only really interested in looking at things in the same way.
Okay, yes, Colin. So, the reason I watched this was this morning, it's been churning in my head all day, is the utter hypocrisy of GB News complaining that there isn't enough divergent thought. I'm wondering when the next few times it will be that we actually hear the phrase BAME on GB News, because I'm willing to bet if the other broadcasters aren't using it, GB News won't either. And I don't know, Colin, do you think you're going to start using the phrase person of colour or coloured people? What do you reckon, Colin? Maybe there's some other words you would like to resurrect. I can think of an awful lot of them I grew up with, words relating to Italians or black people or those of the Jewish faith. Why don't we have those, eh? I don't think so. Do you?